City Councilwoman Kelly wants to know how the residents of her district feel about a proposed school redistricting plan. Which of the following survey methods will allow Councilwoman Kelly to make a valid conclusion about how residents of her district feel about the proposed plan? So before we even look at these, we just have to realize that if you're trying to make a valid conclusion about how the residents of her entire district feel about the proposed plan, she has to find a representative sample and not kind of a skewed sample that would just sample parts of her district. So let's look at her choices. Should she just ask her neighbors? Well, her neighbors, she might live in a part of the neighborhood that might unusually benefit from the redistricting plan or might get hurt from the redistricting plan. And so just her neighbors wouldn't be representative of the district as a whole. So just asking her neighbors probably does not make sense. Ask the residents of Whispering Pines Retirement Community. So once again, this is not the first one skews by geography. She's oversampling her neighbors and not the entire district. Here, she's oversampling a specific age demographic. So here she's oversampling older residents who might have very different opinions than middle-aged or younger residents. So that doesn't make sense either. Ask 200 residents of her district whose names are chosen at random. Well, that seems reasonable. It doesn't seem like, there's some chance that you somehow oversample one direction or another, but it's most likely to give a reasonably representative sample. And this is a pretty large sample size. So it's important to say, what is the random process? Where is she getting these names from? But this actually does seem reasonable. Ask a group of parents at the local playground. Well, once again, this is just like asking your neighbors, and it's also sampling a specific demographic. Now, this might be the demographic that cares most about the schools, but she wants to know how her whole district feels about the redistricting plan. And once again, this is at a local playground. This isn't at all the playgrounds in the district somehow, so I wouldn't do this one either. Let's do one more of these. Mimi wants to conduct a survey of her 300 classmates to determine which candidate for class president, Napoleon Dynamite or Blair Waldorf, is in the lead in the upcoming election. Mimi will ask the question, if the election were today, which candidate would get your vote? Which of the following methods of surveying her classmates will allow Mimi to make valid conclusions about which candidate is in the lead? So let's see. Ask all of the students at Blair's lunch table. No, that would skew it in Blair's favor, probably. That's not a representative sample. Ask all of the members of Napoleon's soccer team. No, same thing. They're likely to go Napoleon's way, or maybe they don't like Napoleon. Maybe they'll go against Napoleon. But either way, this seems like a skewed sample. Put the names of all the students in a hat and draw 50 names. Ask those students whose names are drawn. Well, this seems like a nice random sample that could be nicely representative of the entire population. Ask all students whose names begin with N or B. Well, this could be perceived as kind of random, but notice N is the same starting letter as Napoleon. B is the same starting letter of Blair. You might say, well, that's fair. You're doing it for each of their letters. But maybe there's like 10 people whose names start with an N and only 2 people whose names start with a B. Once again, you're not even getting a large sample. And then on top of that, maybe there's some type of people with the same starting letter somehow like each other more. So I would steer clear of this one. Ask every student in the class. Well, that would work. There's 300 classmates. That might not be that time consuming, and that would be a pretty good. You can't get a better sample than asking everyone in the population. Which of the following methods of surveying her classmates will allow Mimi to make a valid conclusion about which candidate is in the lead? Well, that's a pretty good conclusion. People might change their minds, so it's not a done deal, but you can't get a better sample size than the entire population. Assign numbers to each student in the class, and use a computer program to generate 50 random numbers between 1 and 300. Ask those students whose numbers are selected. Well, this is pretty close to put the names of all the students in a hat and draw 50 names. So I would give this one. That seems reasonable as well.
In the past two examples, Councilwoman Kelly and Mimi were both trying to make a conclusion by surveying a group of people. Councilwoman Kelly was surveying a group of residents about a school redistricting plan, and Mimi was surveying a group of students about who was going to win the class election. Now, for each example, you went through a list of different methods that each of them could have used to survey their population. Everything from asking the neighbors, to asking students whose names begin with an N or a B, to assigning numbers to each student and picking random numbers that way. Now we're going to go ahead and classify or put some sort of vocabulary term to each of those methods. Those methods include population, convenience sample, voluntary sample, random sample, systematic sample, stratified sample, and cluster sample. Once we understand what all those different kinds of samples are, and we have examples of them, we'll finish the video by kind of trying to identify what kind of sample we're taking in each of these examples here. So let's start with population. What is a population? Well, a population is the entire group of individuals we want information about. The way to give a survey to a population is through a census. A census is a survey that collects data from every individual in the population, every single person. So what's an example of a census? Well, in the first example, Councilwoman Kelly was trying to give a survey to her district. So to give a census to her district, that would mean she had to give that survey to every single person in her district. Now that could take a lot of time and a lot of money and probably a lot of people giving surveys, and so it's not always practical to give a census. And in fact, none of these examples that we had down here are a census. In example 2, Mimi was trying to give a survey to the people in her school, her classmates. One of these is actually a census. It happens to be this last one. Asking every student in the class is an example of a census. You've asked every single person. Did you know that the United States gives a census once every 10 years? They recruit thousands of people to give a survey to every single person in the United States, ask them questions like, how many people live in your household, and what's your median income? But again, it's very difficult to give a census. You've got to ask every single person. So when you can't give a census, what do? Instead, you pick a sample of people. Not everyone, but you ask a certain group of people to take your survey. The first kind of sample is called a convenience sample. A convenience sample is when you choose individuals who are easy to reach. For example, if you have to give a survey to your school, a convenient way to do it might be to give a survey to people who sit near you during lunch. You don't have to get up or go anywhere, you just go right around where you're sitting and you give the survey to a few people. That is a convenience sample. One of Councilwoman Kelly's options was to ask her neighbors. If she just walked outside of her house and gave the survey to people that lived right around her, her neighbors, that would have been an example of a convenience sample. Two of Mimi's methods could also be considered convenience samples. Asking all the students at Blair's lunch table or asking all the members of Napoleon's soccer team would be considered convenient because they could simply just give the survey to people who are at their lunch table or the soccer team without actually needing to pick people randomly. Convenience samples. The next kind of sample we have is called a voluntary sample. A voluntary sample is where individuals select themselves by responding to a general invitation. For example, walking to the lunchroom and yelling, "Who wants to take a survey?" is a voluntary sample because people are volunteering to take your survey. Another example would be if there's a flyer up in the hallway of the school that says, "Meet me after school and we'll do this experiment or we'll do the survey," is again voluntary because people are self-selecting or volunteering to take your survey. Now there's an issue with the last two kind of samples we talked about. They both have a high level of bias. Bias occurs when you don't get a representative sample of people to take your survey. For example, if you gave a survey to people who sit near you during lunch, then all those people are probably going to respond pretty positively to whatever survey you have because they're probably your friends and are not a representative group of the entire lunchroom. Or if you walk into the lunchroom and yell, "Who wants to take a survey?" you're probably going to get people who like taking surveys to take your survey. People who are shy or introverted aren't going to take your survey. It's not a representative look at the population. Another example of a biased survey are online food reviews. Online food reviews are considered voluntary surveys because people will go online and review a place based on whether they want to. No one's asked them to do it. They volunteered to do it. In addition, it's biased because people typically write these reviews if they really like the food at a restaurant or if they really hated the food at a restaurant. People that were kind of in between that just thought the food was good typically don't write reviews. And so you end up with a very biased sample that writes these reviews. So if giving a sense is too difficult and giving a convenience sample or a voluntary sample has bias, what can we do to get a representative sample of people if I want to give a survey? Well, there are a few different ways to do it. Let's start with a random sample. A random sample is when you use a chance process to choose people. This can involve pulling names out of a hat, could be flipping a coin, or could be using a random name choosing app on your phone to choose people randomly. Councilwoman Kelly had an example of a random sample. This right here. Ask 200 residents of her district whose names are chosen at random. That is an example of a random sample. Mimi also had two options that were random samples. Putting names in a hat and drawing 50 names out is an example of a random sample. And assigning numbers to each student in the class and using a computer program to generate 50 random numbers between 1 and 300 is an example of a random sample. Similar to a random sample is a systematic sample. In a systematic sample, you choose people according to a certain interval, like every 5th person that walks in the door, or by giving the survey to every 10th person that walks into the lunchroom. Now, the last two types of samples, random and systematic, are both good ways to get a representative sample of your population. That ensures that when you get the information from your survey back, it's not just from your friends or not just from people that were easy to get to, it's truly a representative look at everyone in the group. Now, there are two other kinds of surveys that are occasionally used, stratified and cluster samples. A stratified sample is when you choose people randomly from within predetermined groups. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, in a random sample, you're choosing people from the entire group randomly, using maybe flipping a coin, rolling some dice, or a random number generator, whatever. But let's say you want to ensure that you get maybe a certain number of people from every class. A stratified sample would be where you give a survey to 3 random people in every math class, so you get a survey from every class. Another example of a stratified sample would be if you were a factory worker packaging bottles of soda. If you wanted to make sure that the bottles of soda were good, you might not want to check random bottles because then some boxes would leave without being checked and some boxes would leave with multiple bottles being checked. So instead, you might decide to check one bottle from each box. That's an example of a stratified sample, checking one bottle from each box or some bottles from each group. Stratified samples typically have low bias. The last type of sample we'll talk about is a cluster sample. A cluster sample is when you choose one predetermined group and survey everyone in that group. An example is giving a survey to everyone in the honors geometry class. You pick one group and give the survey to everyone in that group. If you worked in that soda factory, that would mean picking one box and checking every single bottle in that box to make sure they were good. Unfortunately, cluster samples are susceptible to a high amount of bias. That's because you're not getting a representative sample of the entire population, you're just looking specifically at one group. At this point, you should be pretty familiar with all the different kinds of samples. Go ahead and try to answer questions 1 through 6 below. For each one, identify what kind of sample is being used in each situation. Your options include census, convenience sample, voluntary sample, random sample, systematic sample, stratified sample, or cluster. Hint, none of those are used more than once. Pause the video here, try 1 through 6, and we'll finish this next class. Good luck.